We are recording. So it is Tuesday, August 4th, 2020. I am Ann Geisen, and I am here to interview Ray Norrgard for the Minnesota Wildlife Society's COWCH program. So Ray, let's start with some background information about when and where you were born, your parents' names, and where you grew up.
Okay.
Tell us about your education. What colleges or universities did you attend? What degrees did you earn, and when did you graduate?
Okay. Well, I was born in Duluth in 1949. I was born with a congenital heart condition of axillary pathways, and almost didn't survive the first 24 hours. Grew up in the Twin Cities in the north side in Arden Hills. Attended college at University of Minnesota, St. Paul campus. Graduated in 1973, like December of 1973.
What was your degree in?
Degree in wildlife management. I went back to the university in 1975 and hoped to get into graduate school. But I ended up in forestry, studying forest recreation.
Did you get a second degree?
I did not. Like some graduate students, I ran into some issues with research in the paper and ended up parting ways with my advisor. I don't think he was sad to see me go, and I wasn't sad to reject his version of my paper.
How did you decide to pursue a career in wildlife management and conservation?
Okay, well, when I was a kid in grade school and starting in middle school, I was actually kind of a motorhead with a whole stack of hot rod magazines. And when I was 11, my dad took me duck hunting. He took me duck hunting because he was really a dyed-in-the-wool pheasant hunter, but in 1960 there wasn't much for pheasants in central Minnesota, so we hunted ducks. I hunted the very first early teal season in Minnesota. And then in middle school we had each student had an individual project to examine career paths. And I had just finished reading a whole series of books by an author by the name of Lou Ditz, who had a character named Jeff White. And so it was like Jeff White Guide, Jeff White Warden, Jeff White whatever, going through the adventures of a young man in the outdoors careers. And so I started examining careers related to wildlife, and I was conservation officer or wildlife biologist. And so I started focusing on wildlife biologists to learn as much as I could about it. There were probably two books I think that really intrigued me the most. One was Duard Allen's Our Wildlife Legacy, which covered a lot of basic wildlife ecology, predator-prey relationships, population dynamics, and I found it extremely interesting. And then I read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was, of course, was very inspiring.
You said middle school, so would that be about 6th grade? 8th grade?
7th grade.
7th grade.
7th, 8th, and 9th.
How old were you in 7th grade when the bug bit you?
Oh, 11, 12 years old, I suppose. But I was an avid reader. And I still think when I look at the membership in TWS and we have meetings and stuff and I look at the crowd, I always think that within that crowd somewhere there's another Rachel Carson just waiting to bloom. She's so inspiring, and the more you learn about her career, the more inspiring she is.
I'm going to pause it for a sec. What do you mean the function's not available? You're recording. Okay, next question.
So as those early adventures, waterfall hunting really got me excited about it. And almost all my career has been focused on waterfall and on wetland habitat.
Besides the books Our Wildlife Legacy and Silent Spring, were there any other books or hobbies, well, you mentioned waterfall hunting, or any other events that influenced your career choice?
Well, in the early 60s, my parents bought a lake home on Big Pelican Lake by Nisswa, and I spent a lot of time on the water, looking at plants and fish, and we had nest box put up for wood ducks and mergansers. We often had the water was very shallow in front of the lake home, and so we often had spring waterfall stopping there and to refuel. Red-breasted mergansers, common mergansers, primarily, a smattering or other ducks. And in one of the back bays there was a pair of nesting ringnecks, which, thinking about it now, must have been fairly unusual, but the back of that little bay had just a smattering of wild rice and a little bit of boggy ground, and they were actually there for nested there 2 years in a row, and then another house was built, and they never came back after that.
You mentioned a little bit about your waterfall hunting experience with your dad.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to share about your hunting and fishing background?
Well, I was mostly a waterfall hunter. I got into calling, duck calling. I thought that was very interesting, the interaction between calling and the birds responding. I still think that's fascinating with any kind of wildlife that responds to calling. It just adds a whole new dimension to not just to hunting, but just to your interaction with nature, to be able to take part in that. We hunted a small creek, really, called Bogus Brook, which was a small, slow-moving creek. It was probably only about 40 feet across, and then it developed into having a lot of wild rice along it. So that's when I first started paying attention to wild rice. It was very interesting. We would float a canoe down it and flush ducks and herons, and sometimes we'd see mink or otter swimming across the creek. So that was just a huge adventure. Growing up in the cities, we had a couple of places where we could go run around and enjoy nature, but it was kind of slim. The city of Arden Hills had a little park called the Hazelnuts, now it's called, but it was scrub oak and hazelnut shrubs, and actually had a fair amount of prairie grass on it till they converted it into ballparks. It was a very neat place, and we spent a lot of time there. Like kids at that time, we built forts and would hang out and maybe try a little bit of trapping, but mostly just ran around like we were Aborigines or something. We had fun doing it. We also, on occasion, would enter the storm sewer system underneath 35W and explore that. That was kind of spooky, but it was interesting because any place we'd find water back in the storm sewer system, we'd find fathead minnows.
Kind of proving the point that they pretty much can live anywhere.
Yeah, pretty much. Don't need much for oxygen. You don't need much for water to travel. So we would spend days kind of camping out under deadfalls, bringing with a lunch and pretending we were big explorers. There were a lot of cattail marshes in Arden Hills at the time, so we get to see a lot of waterfowl and water birds. That also kind of piqued our interest. There's probably a half a dozen of us that hung together, and we would walk down to a lake to fish, especially if it was raining. We loved fishing in the rain.
Did your dad teach you how to fish?
Yeah, I fished with my family. My dad and my mom both fished. And my sister and I would go out and fish. She was very interested in nature. She got her master's degree from the University of Minnesota in ecology, did her papers on the passflower. So we had some common interests that way. She would take me out with her to where she was doing some of her research at Cedar Creek. And then one year, when Dr. Warner was taking his ornithology class out to South Dakota, she was in that class, and my wife and I traveled with her and had a great time looking at all the birds and stuff. So, and then later on, when I was in wildlife, of course, I took the same class and made the same trip. It was always an adventure going with Doc Warner. We actually ended up settling in Arden Hills.
Is the Warner Nature Reserve named after him?
No.
Okay.
No, that's part of the St. Paul system. That's Lee and Rose Warner.
Gotcha. Who were some of your mentors and how did they influence you?
The what?
Who were some of your mentors?
Oh. Yeah, I was very, very fortunate because I got to know several people pretty well. Roger, within the Department of Natural Resources, Roger Holmes, Larry Nelson, and then outside of that, I got to visit with Art Hawkins a lot when I worked for the Waterfowl Association. and then Harvey K. Nelson with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Harvey and I spent a fair amount of time together. Through Art Hawkins, I got to meet Frank Belrose. I wish I'd taken more advantage of the time that I had to spend with those guys, or make trips out to Northern Prairie and meet some of those researchers. But at the time, it just, time-wise and money-wise, it just wasn't possible to do that. Another person that had a big influence on me was Bill Olmeken, who was, Bill was in the Social Conservation Service, Soil Conservation Service, I'm sorry. And he rose to the rank of Assistant State Director. He had done a lot of field work out in southwestern Minnesota by Benson and Marshall. I think he was the RC&D coordinator for the area around Marshall. And Bill spent a lot of time working with the area wildlife managers out there at the time. He knew Hiram Southwick very well. Bill was always very concerned about waterfowl and waterfowl habitat. Had a lifelong hate for common carp, which rubbed off on me. But even when Bill was in his 70s, he was still going out to a farm he had out there and urging me to work on Simon Lake, which has since been designated as a wildlife management lake. I worked with him to put in the first fish barrier, a high velocity tube, and look at some possible solutions for the soil erosion around the lake. Bill was really important influence in terms of the role that soil plays in the whole natural world. And the second person was Greg Larson, who worked for the Water and Water Soil Resources and was one of the top wetland soil scientists in the country. Greg is a good friend, and he continually inspires me to look at the role that soil plays in wetlands and in general in terms of how habitat is responding. He's the most expert person I know on wetland mitigation, tremendous amount of experience, and a terrific scientific background.
You mentioned some of the wildlife biologists that influenced you, Harvey Nelson, Art Hawkins. What specifically did you learn from those guys, or what did you take away from having working relationships with them?
Well, they were all focused on habitat as being important in terms of wildlife management. Art Hawkins was what I would say risk averse when it came to hunting regulations, and I think that rubbed off on me. He was the flyway, he was the Fish and Wildlife Service representative to the Mississippi Flyway Council, and we often talked about regulations, particularly on species like redheads, and he was very concerned about the direction that regulations were taking.
And how did Harvey Nelson influence you?
Well, I think for all three of those guys, and Frank Belrose and Roger Holmes as well, what's really most impressive is their tenacity. I mean, as they got older, they didn't back off, they just kept working and helping to influence people and paying attention to what was going on. They were terrific biologists in their own right, but it was their dedication and their commitment that was most impressive.
I know one thing that's that's one thing I've learned from you in your example, the need to be tenacious and to plan for the long term, that
Yeah.
it will be a long haul.
Yeah, if you can't beat them, outlast them. That's the motto.
What?
Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
But you have to try.
Yeah, I try, but that works a lot better when you're in your 30s than when you're in your 70s. I don't have a lot of time left to make that big a difference. But I still enjoy reading. And I think the other thing about those guys that served as mentors, and even those that came before them, is the importance of observation. Now, we've really come a long ways, obviously, in terms of research and wildlife management. But sometimes I think that the emphasis on experimental design and statistics kind of works to blind us to the importance of observation, or more technically ocular estimates. And I've seen a few examples of that. One of those is on Big Rice Lake in Cass County near Reamer. It's one of the lakes that's over the years has been surveyed on a pretty regular basis, aerial surveys, because it's a terrific wild rice lake, over 2,000 acres, and attracts a tremendous number of water birds because of that. And I had a couple research biologists once corner me and say they couldn't understand why we thought that lake was so important, because when they would fly over it, they wouldn't see that many ducks. And so I started asking around to some of the guys that hunted a lot, and they said, they looked at me like I was stupid, and they said, well, everybody knows that Big Rice is an afternoon lake. There's no birds on it during the day. As soon as the car doors slam in the morning, the birds leave and they fly out into the forest. And they rest out there during the day and then don't come back till the afternoon and the evening to feed on the wild rice. Sometimes we forget that waterfowl, ducks in particular, are extremely active at night. They don't curl up and go to sleep. That's when they do a lot of feeding. And since then, Charlotte Roy and her research, I think, has demonstrated pretty clearly that that's exactly what ringneck ducks do. That the wild rice lakes are terrifically important, but also what's important is all the small lakes and ponds that are out in the Chippewa National Forest that surrounds that area. I got to spend almost a whole summer with one of the area managers, Rob Naplin, just looking at those small lakes. And we're talking about lakes that might only be 30 acres in size. Some were quite a bit bigger than that. But quite often they were much deeper than what you would expect for a productive wetland from a waterfall standpoint. They might be 6 to 10 feet deep, but had lots of submergent vegetation. White stem pondweed would grow, and 10 feet of water would be growing almost up to the surface. And of course there's mixtures of some of those small lakes were wild rice lakes, some were not. But waterfowl use those lakes a lot. That was a good place for them to rest. And I think we're missing the boat and not looking at the importance of those lakes as refuge areas. Because birds need both food and rest. They need to have some time when they're undisturbed. And with the advent of all-terrain vehicles, the popularity of grouse hunting and deer hunting, a lot of those lakes get disturbed during the day, not necessarily by waterfowl hunters, but just by people banging around. when we developed the 1986 duck recovery plan, one of our strategies was to develop more small refuges because we had lost several that the Fish and Wildlife Service had for a while on their WPAs in western Minnesota, and then decided to eliminate them. We lost 11 refuges, so over a space of about 5 years, instead of having more refuges, we went backwards. Thankfully, there's the area managers at Grand Rapids, Perry Leggering and Tom Rush, and Pierce also understood the importance of refuges and made an effort to create a few additional ones, which I think have worked out pretty well. They also kind of pioneered a technique of using the over-the-counter trail cameras to document how much use those basins got by ducks during the day.
What aspect of your formal education was the most useful in your career?
Well, I'd say in terms of the work that I've done, the most useful was ornithology, I suppose. But I have to say that there were classes I wish I would have spent a lot more time in and paid closer attention to. One of them, as I mentioned, is soils. It's really important understanding soils. Plant physiology is another one. Helps to really understand how habitat changes. And maybe pay more attention to chemistry. I sometimes wonder if I did it all over again, I probably would end up in fisheries instead of wildlife. That's kind of a scary thought, though, for both fisheries and myself.
I know in your career you've done a lot of planning and working with the public and public participation. When you were in college, did you have any classes in planning or public participation or the human aspects of wildlife management?
Well, really not very much, although I took a great course on outcome-based evaluation. And the rhetoric department on the St. Paul campus, although there was always a rivalry between English on the Minneapolis campus and rhetoric on the St. Paul campus. I took speech courses and social survey course through the rhetoric professors on the St. Paul campus. They were very, very good. They're very practical. They did a lot of work outside of college on contracts, so they had a lot of practical experience. Very, very fun to listen to and to learn from. And then, of course, just general ecology courses. If you're in wildlife, you really can't almost get enough of that. I would have spent a little more time in botany and plant physiology than I did.
I can understand that. When I was in college, I did not understand how important the plant classes would be to future work on habitat. Because most of habitat is plants. Not all of it, but yeah, I didn't realize how important it would be when I was in college.
Some of our professors were, of course, extremely knowledgeable in very encouraging. James Beer from mammalogy was just a super person to have in the labs, and very personable. Bill Marshall was a legend and taught our general wildlife ecology classes, would take us on field trips. One of the most important was a field trip up to meet with Gordy Gullion when he was doing his grouse research at the COWCH Forestry Station. Some of the things that Gordy had to say have stuck with me my entire career.
Like what?
Oh, he was very practical. The importance of vegetation structure, not just species, is a critical thing in grouse management. The importance of vertical stem structure.
Yeah, that's important, not just for grouse, but for...
Yeah, I think it shows up even in look at waterfowl and brood cover. I think the relationship of most bird species to trees and shrubs is based more on physical structure of the plants than it is the species.
I would agree with that.
And that runs over into actually fisheries type stuff too. When you look at what constitutes good nursery waters for fry and fingerlings.
True. Very true. We'll go to page 2, and we're recording.
Okay. I'd like to just add some comments about the importance of observation. And unfortunately, the way it's discounted, if you look at it historically, most of the great information that we have in wildlife management, going all the way back to Aldo Leopold, is really based on observation by trained observers. And if you're a professional in wildlife, you are a trained observer. The other thing is that I'm amazed now with our technology. And I'm in my 70s. I just got my first iPhone just a couple months ago, but the ability to take pictures with it, you can be out in the field, be looking at a site, and even if you don't have time or the inclination to take detailed notes, you can always click a picture and you can send that picture to your office. You have it on your hard drive. You've always got it as a reference point. And I think it really works well on wetland management because you can see the amount of coverage by emergent plants. If you can walk out in the basin and actually point the camera down, and you can get an idea of what the water clarity is and have it recorded. It's just amazing. I'm kind of stunned by how useful that is. And as I said, you don't have to take time to write down notes or keep them in a safe place and not lose them, because you can send it right to your own computer. Not to mention to be able to look stuff up. I still struggle a lot with Google Earth because of the viewer on the phone is so limited size-wise that makes it more difficult to use it. But obviously the potential is there. And when you take a picture, it records the picture in Google Earth where you took it. So you always have a record of where you were. There is room underneath each photo to write some short notes on location or subject, and you should do that. But but utilize that. Just, you know, you probably got the phone with you anyways, so it's really great. One of the things that's really important to be learning in the profession is reiteration, going back to the same places month after month, year after year, to watch the changes. And if you use your phone judiciously, it's very helpful to have a running record of that when you do that. And of course, you can also use the phones for video, so you could be taking a video of the site and talking into it, recording your observations, and have that as a part of the record as well. Technology gets a little bit of a bad rap, but you can use it to your advantage. You know, we've had a lot of complaints or comments about nature deficit of young people, and one of the comments was they spend too much time on video games and on their phones. But there was a call in from a grandmother who pointed out that she and her granddaughter go out bird watching together, and when they hear a bird but they're not quite sure what it is, they can go to take their phone, tap into the Cornell Bird Laboratory, pick up the song of the bird and actually play it. And they had situations where they were playing male songs and having the bird that they were trying to observe actually responding to it. So they're calling back and forth. How cool is that? You know, talk about a great learning experience or get excited about nature. So technology is not bad in and of itself, it's just how we use it. And we have a terrific opportunity to put that technology to use. And iPhones are one way to do that.
We'll shift gears for a little bit, and let's talk about your family. Who is your spouse? When and how did you meet? And when did you get married?
Okay. Well, my wife is named Jan. I sat 2 chairs behind her in civics class when we were juniors in high school. And she had this absolutely gorgeous long auburn hair and a wonderful smile and great legs. And it took me a year and a half to work up enough courage to ask her out. But I can still remember that date like it was yesterday. May 19th, 1967. We were pretty young when we were married. We got married at about 22. She helped me all the way through college, typing papers and trying to keep me on a straight line, which has always been a struggle. We have 2 daughters. They were born in 1970s. My oldest daughter was born in 1972, the same year they banned DDT. My youngest daughter was born in 1975. They're both great people, very smart, very politically aware. My oldest daughter is a school teacher. She's teaching right now in Elk River and started teaching in Hudson, Wisconsin, where she took her 4th grade class through a program called Trout in the Classroom, where they hatched trout eggs in the classroom in an aquarium and then watched the trout develop, and then she was able to work in all kinds of things about water quality, because the water had to be just right in the aquarium or they would die. And then as they begin to eat each other, she could talk about population dynamics and about nature. She wrote an article about that experience, complete with pictures. and submitted it to the Department of Natural Resources, but they've never used it as far as I know. But she also had all those kids out at the Willow River State Park with an entomologist from the University of Minnesota looking at invertebrates in the Willow River, which is a trout stream. So it was a great experience for the kids, and I think it just points to what a good teacher she is. She loves to fish, and for a few years she was my #1 pheasant hunting partner. She liked that so much that she got her own dog. She's really into fly fishing and fly fishes with me. So, and then I have 4 granddaughters, all of which are growing up way too fast. All 4 of them own their own cars. 3 of them are headed off to college. The youngest one, who is only 15, just bought her own car and does very well in athletics and is academically in school. She also helps her dad with a livestock operation, and a year ago took grand champion at the Minnesota State Fair with her prospect calf. And she's headed back to the state fair this year, depending on what happens with how they run everything with the COVID. It's going to be a real challenge for them, but she took top honors on the county level 4-H again, so she'll have an opportunity to go back to the state fair. She's an extremely hard worker, very bright. And all of my granddaughters are just a blessing to me. I could spend all my time with them if I could. Of course, COVID-19 has kind of interrupted that, which is unfortunate.
Do all of your granddaughters fish?
Well, I would say that 2 of them are avid fishermen. One, not so much, but she'll go with me. And 2 of them are avid hunters. I got to be with one of the oldest ones when she shot her first deer with a firearm, and worked with my youngest granddaughter, who has taken deer with both firearms and archery. I bought her bow and helped her practice, and she went with her dad, which was great. He said she made a perfect hard shot on a small buck. And she and I we hunted waterfowl together. She really enjoyed hunting ducks. She enjoys the dog work. And we started them with small gauge shotguns. Becca used a 410 to begin with. She killed a couple ducks with that, but then she graduated to a 28 gauge and killed several ducks with the 28 gauge, including, and she killed a really big Canada goose 2 years ago with a 28 gauge over decoys. So they're pretty avid about nature. They enjoy being out in it. They enjoy doing things.
And your second daughter, Jenny, she fishes as well.
Yeah, she fishes with her husband. She fishes with me some, but she was really, starting out, was into hunting more than fishing. We went out to North Dakota together, and her favorite was to hunt sandhill cranes. And she did quite well. She was a good shot.
And she helped teach shooting at Woody Camp.
Yeah, and she's helped as a volunteer instructor at Woody Camp on shooting and to learn to shoot segments.
How has your career affected your family?
Well, there have been times when I felt pretty bad because my career there was quite a few years I traveled a lot.
You work statewide.
Yeah, so I wasn't home very much. I'd see them in the morning when they got up for school, and that was about it. My first job out of college was actually at a nature center in West St. Paul, the Thomas Irving Dodge Nature Center, and they would come and spend time with me there. We had what was called a model farm. They had livestock. And I worked both as a land manager and as an interpretive naturalist for 7th and 8th graders and preschool through 1st grade. That was a great learning experience. I didn't get to do a lot of intensive wildlife management, but learned a lot about running equipment. I had 12 fields that I cropped, but all 12 together only totaled 7 acres, so I did a lot of turning. And I ran a prairie program with the 7th and 8th graders where they would assist with a prescribed burn. That was always kind of exciting, with the flames coming across our little prairie and 30 kids running around.
How did you get that job? Do you remember?
Well, I applied for it. At the time I was working for a small trucking outfit delivering home appliances, refrigerators, laundry, stoves, kitchen appliances, and washing machines and dryers. And then I really needed work. I had been working at Sperry. So I got a job as a school bus driver and a job working as a press operator for Medtronics. For a year it was pretty interesting. I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning because my first bus run was at 7. My last bus run was at 11, and I would come home for lunch and then go to sleep because I had to be at Medtronics by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd get home from Medtronics about midnight. I was working second shift. So I was applying all kinds of different places, and one of the places I applied was at the Nature Center. At the time, I didn't know much of anything about being an interpretive naturalist, but I learned a lot working with naturalists, and then also part of an organization called the Minnesota Association of Interpretive Naturalists. It included folks from other nature centers like Lee and Rose Warner Nature Center and the Park Reserve System, now called the Three Rivers Park Reserve System. All of them just about had naturalists working for them. So I learned a lot about making presentations and trying to keep people's attention on what they found interesting and what they didn't find interesting. Kids help hone you in doing that, but they were great to work with because when they did get excited about something, they'd really get excited. So we'd have them in looking at the livestock, and I had sheep and I had goats, turkeys, ducks, geese, including a captive flock of 15 snow geese. So the kids got to do a lot of touch and feel stuff. And that really helped when I got a job with the Department of Natural Resources and Information Education, working with the Advanced Hunter Education Program. And the educational philosophy of that program really followed the lines of environmental education, where you a lot of hands-on stuff, a lot of question asking and discussion. And I think that's what really helped make that program as good as it was. Unfortunately, it was one of the programs that fell by the wayside within the department. I think it was a real tragedy in terms of recruitment and retention. The people enjoyed going to it, and they would learn about, even if they already hunted, they'd learn about hunting things that they weren't currently hunting. If they were deer hunters, they'd learn about turkey hunting, or if they're waterfowl hunters, they'd learn about grouse hunting or pheasant hunting. And so people would try new things, and very often people who attended that class would bring their wives and their older kids. So it was really a kind of a really neat family kind of a deal. And we would have annual rendezvous for instructors where we'd meet someplace in Minnesota and just have a kind of a camping and activity experience. I remember we did it out at Armstrong Kennels one year, where game fair is held, and I worked with a lot of people that year on learning to shoot skeet. And I had people come up to me years afterwards talking about how they and their son or daughter were now regular skeet shooters, because and that the work that we did with them gave them the confidence to go there. Otherwise it was kind of they'd always wanted to do it, but they found it a little too intimidating. We had to go to the range and all these experienced shooters are out there, but because they had a chance to learn it through the Advanced Hunter Education Program, they felt very comfortable doing it. And for big game, you know, we'd have sessions where we would work with people on blood trailing, make up fake blood and leave trails in the woods, and actually walk people through the experience with instructors who were very experienced themselves, so they could talk about issues and problems and look at solutions to be more effective and more ethical hunters. We pioneered range estimation stuff for waterfowl hunters, and did an awful lot of work on non-toxic shot and helping hunters just try steel shot and pattern it and work with it to build confidence in using it. I would say that the work that the Advanced Hunter Education Program did on non-toxic shot was a model for the entire country. I don't think any other state had as good an acceptance of non-toxic shot for waterfowl hunting in Minnesota. Not that we didn't have those that questioned it, because we did, but for the most part it went very smoothly when we went all non-toxic shot for waterfowl hunting.
After your first position at the Nature Center, can you briefly list the positions you had since then?
Okay. When my position was coming to a close at the Nature Center, that's when I went back to grad school for a short time in forestry. and I saw a notice for a job, for a position on the planning team for the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge and Recreation Area. And I was fortunate, I was selected for that position there. So that was my introduction to planning and planning mechanics, and worked with great people from private consulting firm, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and DNR. So I was actually like a natural resource specialist within the Bureau of Planning for DNR in central office.
And after that?
Then after that, I was out of work and desperate. I was able to, through some friends in the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was able to get a position working with the Mid-Continent Waterfowl project, which was not exactly a research project. It was an effort headed up by Carl Mattson, and I think was the brainchild of Harvey K. Nelson, where we were taking research being developed and trying to apply it on the ground. One of those things was working with private landowners on wetland restorations. It was some of the first work that was done in the state. And there were three of us on that crew, myself, Tony Rondeau, and Jim Peel. A good mixture of expertise. I'd been doing some wetland restorations with the Waterfowl Association, and working with both Fish and Wildlife Service and DNR field folks. So I worked on the Mid-Continent project for a little more than half a year. Really learned a lot, met some great people. Made some really good friends. And again, got to work with folks like Carl Mattson, who are very experienced biologists. And the thing was, they're also very pragmatic and willing to try new things. Carl was one of the first ones to actually kind of experiment with how much money it would take to convince a landowner to restore a basin instead of farm it. And so we ran 10-year contracts on the restorations we did. Some of which are still on the ground out in Otter Tail County. We worked in Otter Tail, Douglas, and Grant counties. Restored close to 350 basins in total. I remember on one parcel Tony and I worked on, we decided to focus on temporary wetlands, and we surveyed it and laid out the dike work for some 60 basins just on one parcel of land. Some consider that to be the beginning of the Fish and Wildlife Service Fish and Wildlife Partners program that is so active now, with Sheldon Merchant heading it up for the state, and with biologists throughout Minnesota and throughout Fish and Wildlife Service Region 3. And they're still doing absolutely super work, still experimenting with new ideas and improving the results on what they're doing. Still working with landowners, and now have been able to take a lot of work in purchasing easements. I worked with Stacy Savavold and Sean Papin in Fergus Falls, in establishing a habitat easement on some of my property here near Dalton. And I've been really impressed with the number of easements that Sean is working on. It's just amazing how much habitat that is. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is, with duck stamp money and other sources, are paying for the purchase of the easements, and the Outdoor Heritage Fund through the Lesage Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council are providing grants to pay for the habitat restoration itself on the land that's covered by the easement. And they're just, it's just really great. I haven't had a chance to, Sean has already laid out and done the prairie plantings. I have a little bit of native prairie here, and then I had about 60 acres of CRP that was in planted prairie. And we were able to expand on that through the easement program. And I'm really excited because Sean and I think we've got opportunities for 5 or 6 wetland restorations on the property here. So there's good things happening out there, but sometimes we get kind of down. In fact, one of the things that has kind of had me concerned recently is I talk to folks, Fish and Wildlife professionals, and regardless of agency or those within TWS, and people are they're just kind of down. It's like a general malaise. And I couldn't figure it out, And then I realized it was just, given our current situation nationally and internationally and even within the state, people really, they're like they're grieving. They've really lost something that they highly prized and loved. And I know a little bit about dealing with grief, so I understand what they're going through. And the only thing I can think of to share with you on that is that in the book American Pie by Michael Lee West, he has a passage on grief. And he talks about it this way. He said, when you lose something you really love or someone you really love, and people come up and tell you that you're going to get over it, he said there ought to be a little bell that goes off in your head that tells you that that person doesn't know grief from garlic grits. Because there's some things that you're just not going to get over. And it doesn't mean that you wallow in grief and sorrow and pity, but understand that it's a difficult journey. Michael says it's like somebody dumps a big pile of rock right in the middle of your front yard, and every morning you wake up and you look out the window and there's that damn pile of rocks. And they're big and they're ugly and they're sharp. And it's the first thing you see every time you wake up. And some people will go out the back door and kind of shield their eyes and walk past it and try to ignore it and get used to it. Other people will try to plant flowers or shrubs and try to hide it. But those that really understand it will go to that pile of rocks and they'll pick them up one by one and look at them and examine the shape and the size, and they'll take it and they'll use it to build a path forward. And I think that's what we really have to do in our profession. I mean, it's terrible what's happening to the environment and funding and programs and lack of confidence in government and so on and so forth. But there are good things that we can take a hold of. There are these rocks that we can build a foundation with. There are statutes, there are funding programs, there's education programs. And we just need to take a close look and take those things and build on them for the future. We've had great government in the past, and we will in the future. We just have to be prepared for that future so that we can take advantage of it.
So after the Mid-Continent project, what was next in your career?
Okay. After Mid-Continent, I was in contact with folks at the DNR, and they were creating a planning team to develop a comprehensive planning system for the Division of Fish and Wildlife, headed up by Bruce Hawkinson. And I applied for a job there and was able to get hired. Worked with three really great people. Bruce Hawkinson, whose background was fisheries. Pat Carnes, who was almost an icon in terms of wildlife management in Minnesota. Pat was a forest wildlife researcher, particularly looking at moose. Who was internationally acclaimed, and in fact even traveled to Russia to consult with researchers there. He was also kind of a free spirit, so he wasn't held back by convention. That was inspirational. And then Brian Stenquist was the third one. Brian was an expert planner, facilitator, extremely skilled, and we became good friends. Was also a very concerned global environmentalist, which helps broaden your perspective on things.
How long was that position?
I was in that position, I think, for 2 years. And in 1985, I kind of reached the point with the Waterfowl Association where the travel and the stress of the job was just time to move on. And that doesn't mean that they weren't good to work for, because they were, but when you have habitat programs and legislative programs, and none of it can go forward without funding, and you've got to go out and hustle that money yourself, that means that you're gone a lot. You're out meeting with chapters, you're out meeting with agencies, and as a part of that, legislatively, I started working with some folks who were putting together the Reinvest in Minnesota program. I co-chaired the RIM Coalition for the better part of a year, and then became the what I would call the recording secretary. I kept the minutes for the coalition. And I did that while I was working with the planning team in the DNR. A lot of late nights, in the legislature, which is a good experience, but if you haven't done it, you maybe don't realize just how challenging that can be. With committee meetings may run into the early morning hours, and when you're in a committee meeting in the audience, you're not allowed to have beverages or anything to eat, so you sit there at midnight watching people drink coffee and eat donuts, and you got nothing. But you still got to try to keep aware of everything that's going on in the discussion. At the time in the Minnesota legislature, we had a flush of new legislators that tended to be Republican, Christian, right? And there were times when they would take it upon themselves during a committee meeting to look at us up in the audience and ridicule us. So frustrating at times, but they were also great legislative leaders as well. One of them was John Rose, who was the Republican representative from Roseville, and he was the co-author of all of the RIM legislation. And the other co-author was Willard Munger, a Democrat from Duluth, who was well renowned for his environmental leanings and no-nonsense approach when he was running committee meetings. Very, very interesting fellow who actually grew up in Otter Tail County. But I got to also, within the coalition, got to work with the leadership of many, many different organizations. There were 52 organizations belonging to the coalition. They ranged from Sierra Club Project Environment all the way over to the Minnesota Corn Growers, Deer Hunters Association, the Waterfowl Association, occasionally Ducks Unlimited, Minnesota Conservation Federation, Isaac Walton League, Minnesota Association of Swimwater Conservation Districts. And it really helps you to understand that there's really great people who are dedicated, committed, and very bright. And almost every organization in Minnesota, we're very, very lucky. We're lucky we have as many organizations as we do and the people that we have in leadership positions. It's really marvelous. So I worked on that while I was on the planning team, and then I was appointed RIM coordinator for the Department of Natural Resources. I held that position for I don't even know, a year and a half. My first experience with having money for projects and having professionals refuse to spend it because they disagreed with it philosophically. That had to do with money for aspen recycling and forestry. Looking back, I probably could have done a lot better in terms of building bridges to help those projects happen.
After RIM coordinator?
After RIM coordinator, well, I was RIM coordinator. Kevin Lyons, who was what was called the Game Lakes coordinator, which is the same position as Shallow Lakes program supervisor, now held by Nikki Hansel Welch. Kevin switched gears and became North Metro Area Wildlife Manager. So I applied for his old position and was appointed. I suppose that was in the late 80s, 1990 maybe.
And you had that position for a while, I think until 2001, right? Or 2000?
Well, yeah. I had this great opportunity at the turn of the century to interview two great professionals, Ann Geisen and Nikki Hansel Welch, for positions with that program.
Well, Ray, this interview is about you.
And that's when that program really took off. Nikki brought a great deal of expertise because she did her master's degree. You know, she didn't get her doctorate on Christina, got her master's.
Her master's,
Got her master's degree studying Lake Christina under Malcolm Butler at NDSU, and working with Mark Hansen in the DNR research group. And that program really began to coalesce into a great program, unique nationally, really. There's nothing else quite like it.
So let's talk briefly about your experience as the game lake coordinator, shallow lake coordinator that you held for about 10 or 11 years. What kinds of things did you do?
Well, I worked mostly with area staff. At the time, we had several lakes, in fact about a third of the lakes that were designated and where we had the legal authority to manage them, we were unable to either because of physical or political barriers. So I spent most of my time working with those area managers and trying to find ways around that to get those lakes managed. It's another example where, looking back, I can see where I could have done a much better job. Perhaps focusing on getting more lakes designated and not worrying about the management right at the time. But I was very frustrated by this idea that we had legal authority to manage lakes, but there were physical barriers to doing it. And one of those, we also had some financial barriers. That was resolved, at least in part, by the passage of the state waterfall stamp in 1977. But I kind of cringe now when I think about my lack of expertise when I took on that position. I knew nothing about data management, and had to carry a field book with me when I was looking at plants. Although Kevin Lyons was kind enough to go out with me and mentor me, and at least on some of the plant identification, and Tom Carlson, who was office in Fergus Falls, was also a great help. So it was really an opportunity to learn a lot. I learned a lot. I don't know how much good I did, but I learned a lot. We were able to get, with Tim Bremaker's help, we were able to put together a couple of LCMR proposals, one for Swan Lake and one just for the program in general. And I took that money for the program and went whole hog in purchasing equipment, because we were really short of real decent equipment. So we bought canoes and boats and outboard motors and put them to work. We didn't even, at the time when Kevin was there, he didn't even have a decent truck. Half the time he drove around in a sedan with a canoe strapped on top. And then when he did get a truck, I found out after I took over the position, that if you were driving that truck, it was a slant 6 Dodge, in the middle of the winter, the carburetor would ice up, and you'd be in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden you had no engine. You just coast to a stop. You'd have to get out and open the hood and try to get the ice out of the carburetor. So we got good equipment to start out with. So I think when Nikki and Ann started, we had a little better equipment. They had a little something better to work with.
We had a truck that ran, that's for sure.
And I had completed one research project with Ray Norrgard at the University of Minnesota looking at survey strategies to get statistically valid survey information. And Nikki built on that research to develop standardized methodology. So that's made a big difference in terms of the worthwhileness of that data.
After your time as Shallow Lakes coordinator, your next position was, I think, wetland program leader in St. Paul, correct?
Yes.
And you held that position until when?
I held that position until the section went through a reorganization. And those positions were eliminated and replaced with a new structure. That would have been about 2009, 2010.
And after that, you became the wetland habitat consultant, and your positions shifted to Fergus Falls.
Well, what happened is, to be truthful, is that in 2010 I found I only had one door open to me, and that was to go back to the field. Dennis Simon, who was section chief, was very interested in developing a program for wetland management. And I had been complaining for years about needing to do something to build wetland complexes. That the Shallow Lake program was great, but we needed to have something similar for wetlands. It would really bother me that you drive around the state and you go by one wetland would have ducks on it, and another wetland, perhaps quite a few of them, would have nothing on them, because it didn't have active management. There may have been, at about the same time, Mark Hansen and Brian Herwig were doing wonderful research on fish in wetlands and documenting some of those relationships where fish were having a negative impact on wetlands. So that was really inspiring. That was really an epiphany, I think, for wetland management to recognize that that could be going on. And although you spent the money to buy the wetland and you put water back on it, you still didn't really have an ecologically valuable piece of real estate. So my position was moved to Fergus Falls, and I worked with area managers on assessing wetlands and trying to develop strategies for improving them. Mark Hansen was continuing his research, and I occasionally got to help a little bit with that. But I worked with the Fergus staff, Don Schultz, Mike Ehler, Doug Hetke, Tom Carlson, and also worked quite a lot with Kevin Kotz in Glenwood, and Kurt Vosek at Lac La Parle. Again, it was a great opportunity to try things, to do things, to make some progress, and to learn a lot. Mark Hansen was really my mentor for quite a while there. And I learned quite a bit from Tom Carlson, who was also willing to try things on the ground. In some cases doing vegetation transplants or creating loafing areas. And some of what we learned on doing wetland restorations, of course, came into play as well. Because now we're able to go back and look at those basins and see what happened to them. Some were beautiful, some not so beautiful. And that research has continued within the Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program.
Ready to start?
Sure.
So, one of the positions you've held was as executive director of the Minnesota Waterfowl Association. And you said that was from 1980 to 1985.
Yep, that's correct.
Talk a little bit about that position.
Well, I'm sure this is true of almost any nonprofit organization. The executive director is kind of the lead staff person, but they generally have no power. The chief financial officer, if there is one, is the one that has power. Or if they have a chief executive officer, which is not the same as executive director. But working with a volunteer organization, just working with volunteers, is an interesting experience. Because they come and go, there's no longevity to it. And the truth is that many people don't think about volunteering unless really they're kind of missing something in their life. They're looking for a purpose, or they're looking for some self-satisfaction. And so they aren't necessarily a volunteer for the reasons that you would like them to be a volunteer. They're a volunteer because of something they need. And you have to understand that. And the most important job when you're working on volunteer programs is to convince your volunteers that their first responsibility as a volunteer is to find their replacement, so that when they finally have to withdraw because it gets to be too much, there's no time or whatever, conflict with family, a lot of reasons can interfere with it, then they need to have somebody else that can step in, that they can mentor in that position. Otherwise, it's like you're missing a staff person. So you get all kinds of different characters. I worked with a veterinarian who was for all practical purposes a genius. I worked with a meat cutter who was on disability that was as mean as a snake. It was just really, really difficult and very vociferous, extremely difficult to work with. But most of the people had a good heart, and they tried to do their best. But it just you're asking them to do something that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and can be stressful, in addition to everything they're already doing in their life. And that's a tough request. But that's what you do. And you aren't really misusing them, because they really want to accomplish something. But you have to be careful that you don't ask too much. And you're thinking only about what you need to have done, not what they need to get out of it. So if you work for a nonprofit, you're going to be working with volunteers. If you work with an education program, very often you're working with volunteer instructors. And with any agency, there's always a possibility that they'll have some kind of a volunteer program to assist staff, and you'll be working with volunteers in that regard. It's just important to understand, or try to understand, where your volunteer is coming from, and see that they get a return on their investment of time.
Is it correct that you were the first executive director of the Minnesota Waterfowl Association?
I was actually the second. Bob Lick was the first.
Okay.
Bob was killed in a car accident on his way to an executive committee meeting after meeting with Roger Holmes.
What kind of work did you do for MWA? I know you talked a little bit already about wetland restorations. Were those on public land, private land, some of both?
Well, it was both. There were some on private land, but the ones that were the easiest to work with were where you had an area wildlife manager, DNR, or a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who wanted to do restorations on public land that they owned.
Besides wetland restorations, did you do any other kind of habitat projects?
No. I have occasionally maybe provide a little bit of advice on forest management on small plots, but nesting boxes were always a big interest for people.
So
But I wasn't really knowledgeable enough to work on grassland and prairie management. I probably worked as much on policy as anything. So I couldn't lobby myself in my position without breaking the law, but I could advise those in our organization that were doing the lobbying. And that's what I did. And I dabbled a little bit actually writing legislation. I have drafted statutes, drafted budget items.
So as executive director, you wore a lot of hats. You were coordinating the volunteers, and I am guessing the MWA banquets and fundraisers for the local chapters, or at least helping out with that. You were working on wetland restorations. You were working on policy. Any other roles as executive director?
And then you're the face of the organization, so you'd get invited by Rotary clubs or service organizations to be their monthly luncheon speaker, kind of a thing. People would try to drag you into local controversies over road projects or any kind of development project where it might affect a wetland or a little bit of habitat they were concerned about. They would think that wildlife is so important that if they can get you to come in and speak to the city council or whatever, or speak at a public hearing, that would be what they needed to win. And the truth was that what I had to say would almost never make any difference at all. So I got smart enough after a while that I would look at what they were doing and I'd advise them. And generally, if they could find some public safety issue, that was their most effective tool for affecting the outcome. Wildlife issues were pretty far down the list for city council members or township board members.
So you've talked about the various positions you've held, from working at the Dodge Nature Center, being planner for DNR, the Fish and Wildlife Service Mid-Continent Waterfowl Project, the RIM positions, the Game Lake Coordinator, and the Wetland Program Consultant. Considering, all those jobs, what was the pay and benefits like?
Well, it would be, I would say for the most part, it would be on the same level as a technician position within an agency. Although the first job that I had on the Fish and Wildlife Service planning team for the Minnesota Valley, I was a member of the DNR team, and my position was rated as an NRS specialist, which at the time would have been about the same as an NRS 3.
And for folks not familiar with, say, the DNR pay scale, would you say it was good, high, moderate, low, above average?
It's generally pretty poor. My first job with the Nature Center, my total salary was $13,000 a year, and I made more working part-time on the truck line than I did working that full-time job. And I put a lot of hours in there. That was the case with the MWA. I had a pretty good boost in pay. I started out at $17,000, but I kept very good daily records so that I would never be questioned on expenditures. And from March of 1980 to March of 1985, I averaged 56 hours a week, every week, and that of actual work, that didn't count vacation time or any kind of sick leave. So you can think about that. That's the same as working 7 days a week at 8 hours a day, or what is that? Or it's close to 12 hours a day for 5 days.
Right.
So it was pretty demanding. A lot of that time was travel, which isn't very physically demanding, but nonetheless it's not the same as not working either. So at the end of 5 years, I was just pretty wore down. As I said, time away from the family. That was one of the reasons why I just had to move on. It was just consuming.
And especially when you're working statewide, travel time can eat up a big chunk of your workday.
Yeah, I had days, this is one of the worst examples. I had days where I'd drive from Bloomington, Minnesota to Bemidji, look at projects during the day, attend a chapter meeting that night and then drive home to Arden Hills. So working a 20 or 22-hour day was not that uncommon. You're basically living on chemicals when you do that. It's caffeine and nicotine. I don't recommend that for anybody, but it's what it was at the time. A 12-pack of Pepsi and a pack of cigarettes, and you take off and go all day.
With all the positions you had, were there any promotional opportunities?
Well, no, at MWA I was at the top. I could have argued for more pay, but there was no place to go. And within DNR, it's not fair to say that there's none, but it's challenging. And in the Fish and Wildlife Service, most of your promotions are based on your willingness to move to a new location, sometimes all the way across the country.
That also, I think, seems to be true for the DNR, that, or at least there's more promotional opportunities if you are willing to move
Yes.
around the state.
Yeah. And the truth is, when I was with the years I was with the DNR, at least within the section of wildlife, there's probably only a handful of people that I knew that had worked in more than one region. Most everybody starts in a region, they get a job, they kind of get established locally, and then it's hard for them to move.
Well, when you get married and have kids and your spouse has a job and your kids are in school and have friends, it's hard to uproot.
There's a financial and a psychological cost to moving as well. I mean, to pick up your household and pack up everything and travel and then get someplace and unpack everything, and that's not an easy thing. When I left St. Paul, I basically moved 2 households. One from the Lake Place in Brainerd and the other one from the Twin Cities in Arden Hills. It took months to do that. Took an entire summer. From snow melt to snowfall.
Ray, can you just briefly describe the wildlife profession of today and how it has changed over time since you started as a wildlife professional? Which I get is kind of a big, complex question to try and break down. But give us your thoughts.
Well, one of the things, and I guess this goes back to some of the people I knew historically, but you read some of the classic books and you look at the information, even starting with Aldo Leopold, just look at how much of that information was based on observation. Now it's kind of learned observation. I mean, it's by trained individuals, so they're very careful about what they observe. But I think it's a good lesson to remember that people that have spent a lot of time out there have very useful information. Don't discard it readily. I found that in my career that trappers and bait dealers were both worthwhile listening to in terms of what they observed, because they're out there every day working. That doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with their conclusions, but it just means that you give some credence to their observations. I think the same thing is true with professional staff. So if I'm looking at the world statewide from central office, and who am I to question an area manager who goes out and works on his units every day of the year in all kinds of weather? Even if those observations don't necessarily agree with the last juried paper that you read. Ocular estimates, pay attention to that. And again, we've got the technology to make that easier, and particularly a lot easier to record. Can you hand me that sheet for a second?
Certainly.
I just had a couple of things just worthwhile, just to think about, roll around on your brain for a while. The first was from Albert Einstein, because it seems like we have this predilection to have to reduce everything to numbers. Number of ducks, number of plants, number of occurrences. One of Einstein's best quotes was, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." So there are observations of things going on out there that maybe you can't put a number on. Doesn't mean that they aren't important. They may be related to behavioral things. And the other thing is lack of evidence of effect is not the same as lack of effect. So if you're working on a habitat project and you believe that you see a relationship or an effect based on what's happening, and you try to measure it, and you don't come up with a statistically valid answer, that doesn't mean that the effect didn't take place. It means that you can't prove it to a juried group of editors necessarily, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Now that's fighting words for some researchers, but you think about what a model is. A model is really just a prediction based on probabilities and some set of criteria. If you had all the information, so the probability was 100%, it wouldn't be a model, it would be a fact. So models are just there to help us understand relationships and kind of predict them. They are not in and of themselves factual. Okay. I'm assuming now all of this is TWS, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm assuming the people here are wildlife professionals or wildlife wannabe professionals. You have to understand that when it comes to environmental issues, and I mean even globally, that fish and wildlife professionals are always going to be on the front line because of the charismatic nature and economic value of fish and wildlife. It's just you're always going to be there whether you want to be there or not. So you have to sometimes have that little broader view and be willing to step into that mode. Ask yourself, whose world is this? And the answer is, it's your world, and my world, and our children's world, and our children's children's world. This world does not belong to those who are only looking at the bottom line on a ledger sheet. It will never belong to them, because if for no other reason, they'll destroy it before they realize what a great place it is. And when that happens, it'll be their judgment day, and ours. It's twilight in the Garden of Eden. And for some, the Garden of Eden is an abstract concept out of the biblical history. But the truth is, the Garden of Eden is right here and right now. This humble rock supports almost 8 billion people and millions of other living species. And it belongs to you. And your friends, and me, and our children, and our children's children. It is our world. It is not the world of those who seek only the golden fruit. Who are myopic from spending days poring over ledgers looking for the bottom line. It will never be their world, because they are so focused on greed and pride that they can't see what a marvelous place it is. And by the time they start to even think about that, they will already have destroyed it. And when they destroy it, that will be their judgment day. And unfortunately, if we don't prevent it, it will be ours as well. As fish and wildlife professionals, you will always be on the front line of that battle, because of the charismatic nature of wildlife and the economic value. You will always be there. That will always be the lead issue for environmental issues. And while the focus might be on charismatic mega creatures like elephants or blue whales, and those things are important, and the world will be less without them, but you need to think much smaller than that. The real key to our survival is microbes and bacteria, because without them, there will be no soil. And if there's no soil, or only poor soil, nothing else will survive. But you will be on the front lines of that battle. So take care. And I hope in that endeavor that you'll be able to work for an administration or for leadership that values daring and dissent, who will accept controversy as the impetus for healthy change. That whether your position is high or low, that you'll be valued for the job that you do, and not the size of your budget, your office, or your staff. So that you can look back in future years and be able to say with pride and honor that you serve this country and this world in its hour of need. So keep the faith, be tenacious, work hard and stay committed. Public service is the most honorable career that I can think of. I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where public service was highly valued. No one questioned my desire to do what I wanted to do. My uncles and aunts on both sides of the family and cousins served in all branches of the military. They served in medicine, in the ministry, and in education, and still do. So prize your time as public servants, and don't wait until you're old like I am to think about what you've accomplished. Every day, at the end of the day, take some time to think about the difference that you've made, because every phone call, every meeting, every project you complete, every letter you write makes this world a better place for us all. Thank you.
What would be your best professional advice for a young Ray Norrgard today?
Well, I would say that if you were still in school and college, that you should take coursework that helps you understand water from both a physical standpoint and a chemical standpoint, because the further we get into the future, the more likely it is that that's where the jobs and the controversy is going to be, is in managing water. Certainly from a fish and wildlife standpoint, but also just from a human standpoint.
Looking back over your career, is there anything you know now that you wished you knew earlier in your career?
Yeah, I wish I'd known and thought more about 401s. Yeah,
Meaning 401k plans?
Yeah, that sounds kind of silly, but it's a factor in just being able to survive. The great news is that if you work for a public agency, federal, state, or county, there's a good likelihood that you're going to have a pension plan, which can be a lifesaver as you go on in life. And you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I was just going to mention this about safety. In a lot of DNR meetings, they'll have to start out with a safety talk. Well, let me talk about this. 18 months ago, I had a stroke, and my left side was paralyzed. And a stroke just doesn't happen to old white guys. It can happen to anybody at any age. And you need to understand that where a stroke comes from, it's just a blockage in a vein. And if people have AFib like I do, and I've had my whole life, it's just any place where the blood will kind of pool up a little bit, it can form a clot that will end up being a blockage. Or it can come from other things as well, obviously, from plaque in your vessels. But the point is that it can happen to anybody at any age. And it could have happened to me at any age. I was very fortunate that I lived this long before I had one. If you're working with someone and for any reason you're a little suspicious that maybe they look like they lost their balance a little bit, or they responded to a question and it wasn't the way that they normally talk, take the time to just look at them, have them face you, and hold their arms up to their side, or smile, or close one eye. And what you watch, it's really simple. You just need to watch for symmetry. If one arm is higher than the other, if one corner of the mouth is higher than the other, if one eyebrow is higher than the other, that's a sign that the person could could be having a blockage. So it's a real simple thing to check and just watch for, but just remember it's not just old guys that can happen to. And I was very lucky because I survived it. I was lucky because I had a tremendous support group of friends. In fact, I was kind of a celebrity at Sanford Rehabilitation Hospital because of all the cards I had on my windowsill that people had sent. And those things make a difference to people in terms of, you know, how they're feeling in terms of optimism makes a difference in how they heal. So just touching base with people that you hear about. Sometimes you think, oh gosh, you know, that's such a serious thing that this card doesn't mean anything or a phone call doesn't mean anything, but that's not true. They absolutely mean a great deal to people. If they've just lost somebody or been injured or lost their job, just the fact that somebody cares about them is important. And then it's, my intentions are to try to keep involved in fish and wildlife management to the extent that I can. And nothing makes my day more enjoyable than to have to think about responding to a question or somebody sharing an experience. I welcome anyone if they want to ask me anything. Obviously, right now I have 3 specialties: stroke, wetlands, and waterfall. So that's where I can be the most help. But being an old guy, I have an opinion about everything, and I'm not afraid to give it to you. So if you're looking for advice, this is the place to come.
It's good to know that even though you're retired, the shingle is still out.
Yep. I don't expect to make money on it. I just want to be involved in it. So I know all of you will be out there. I look at the group at TWS and the enthusiasm and the intellect of the people there, and I know all of you will be doing a great job as professionals.
What were the most useful tools or instruments you used over the course of your career? Anything stand out?
The most useful tool was a pair of waders. I think it's important to understand that when you look at wetlands or aquatic management, that standing on shore doesn't do anything. If your belt isn't wet or you aren't wet above your belt, then you don't know anything. You need to get out there, whether you're wearing waders or not wearing waders. In environmental education, we had a technique called acclimatization. You take kids and if you're working on a pond study, they had to get in the pond. They had to get their feet in the muck. They had to feel it squish around their toes, feel the plants against their skin. And as professionals, sometimes we forget that that's a part of it. Don't be afraid to immerse yourself. Lay out on a prairie at night and just listen. This sounds worse, but throwing out a sack in the middle of the woods and spending the night is cool too. Listen to the sounds. Know that there's critters moving all night. I had to do that once in Boy Scouts, and it was a really neat experience, despite the mosquitoes. You can get used to mosquitoes. Gnats were the ones that I couldn't stand because I was kind of allergic to them. I'd get an allergic reaction from them, but you can kind of get used to mosquitoes after they bite you 1,000 times. So think about that. It's a fun thing to do. You read stories about listening to the wind blow through the grass, but that's not the same as going out there and laying on the grass and listening to the wind blow through the grass. Or listening to waterfall talk on the water at night. But most people think they're sleeping, and you know they're talking because they're fighting over food. Have a good life, stay in touch, be safe.
What is the most interesting project you were involved with?
I would have to say that the Reinvest, Minnesota Reinvest in Minnesota program was probably the most interesting because it had so many different elements. There was a habitat element to it, there was a political element to it, working with legislators, and then getting exposed to all these different people, all these great people from these groups who are all coming together to share ideas and form a unified effort. And they did. And it passed in 1986. There was a lot of surprised people. But the vote was almost unanimous in the legislature. And the Outdoor Heritage Fund was, the constitutional amendment was a similar thing. I think the greatest day in conservation in Minnesota was in April 2005 when we had 5,000 people on the lawn of the Capitol all talking about the importance of a constitutionally dedicated fund. That was a great day. And there are people from all different walks of life, from all different agencies, from all the nonprofits. They were all there. One of our area managers, Stan Woods, who was the manager of Roseau River, he and his son got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and drove all the way down from Roseau just to be at that event. And there were other people like Stan that did that. It was just a great day to see the real energy in this state for conservation. And although we tend to badmouth legislators sometimes, or a lot of times, and they can be very frustrating, you need to think about them as partners. Because nothing can happen without funding, and no funding can happen without legislative approval. And there's some really, really fine legislators in terms of their concern about the environment. So that in itself was interesting.
Would that also be your favorite project or the most fun project you worked on, or would that be a different one?
Well, that was pretty fun. It happened, actually happened not exactly at the same time as the budget crunch, but very close to the time when the state had a huge budget crunch. It was so severe that my wife and I were at a Waterfall Association event, and Rudy and Lola Purpich attended that event, and my wife sat right between them. And Rudy, who you probably don't know much about, was very much a people person. He really enjoyed being out with people and talking to people. And so there's my poor wife sitting next to Rudy, the governor of the state. He's holding his head in his hands, telling her that he doesn't know what the hell we're going to do, that the state's going down the tubes. And of course we came out of it, and it was just a year later we were passing RIM. It's to the tune of $60 million, which pales in comparison to the Outdoor Heritage Fund, but nonetheless at the time was extremely important. And there were some policy issues too. The RIM Reserve became a model for the federal farm program.
So let me clarify. A Minnesota state program became a model for a federal program.
Yeah, for the federal farm legislation.
Pretty impressive. Describe the most pressing issue you had to deal with in your career. How was it resolved, and has your perspective or opinion changed over time?
Well, I think the most difficult issue I had to deal with was palace intrigue. Just the internal politics that happens in every organization. And it wasn't resolved.
Any tips or tricks you learned to deal with it?
Yeah, kiss the Pope's ring. Make sure that when you disagree internally, if your boss is wrong, it's okay to talk to your boss in private about it and let them have a chance to explain things to you from their perspective. When things head downhill is when things are said outside of that privacy. So in any agency, you need to be careful about that when you're communicating or complaining about something, or get yourself all up in a dander then. Polite, private conversations are almost always acceptable. Spouting off, it never is. And particularly if it's contrary to the leadership's stands on issues. There's no such thing as a loyal heretic. Either you're a heretic or you're not. The damage that you do, whether you're loyal or not, is the same. So, and that's going to hold true regardless of what kind of public service you do, whether it's within government, within agency, or within a nonprofit, or the University of Minnesota, or any large organization, private corporation. It's the same no matter where people are trying to organize. You have those same issues come up. You just have to learn to deal with them politely. Keep your chin up, just don't lead with it. Known as Buck Norrgard, also known as Blade.
Who calls you Blade?
My granddaughters.
Because you always have a knife handy?
And I'm always giving them knives. Because I think every person should carry a knife.
I used to work for a technician who said every good wildlifer always had a knife. That was one of his standards.
Well, everybody should always have a knife.
Okay, Ray, let's hear the sparrow parable.
Okay. This is my father's story. He spent a lot of time on his grandfather's farm up by Lawler, Minnesota. It's up and by McGregor, not too far from McGregor, so it's quite cold, small farms. And it was during the middle of the winter, and they had a relatively small barn and a few cattle, and the cattle were huddled in the cow yard by the barn waiting to go in. And there was a hand pump there that pumped water into the water trough. And these sparrows flew in from someplace around the farm, and they landed on that pump handle. And they sat there in the sun trying to get warm. And cattle were doing what cattle do, and were downloading. And sparrows did what sparrows do. They would fly down to the nice warm clumps of discharge and pick through it for bits of food or insects, and then would fly back up on the pump handle and sit in the sun and try to stay warm. And it was working pretty good. They were pretty happy. They had full stomachs, and the sun was pretty warm, but as the day went on, of course, the sun began to go down and it got colder. And as it got colder, they began to look at the barn. The barn door was open, and kept thinking about how nice and warm it would be inside that barn. Finally, one of them decided he was going to go for the barn. And it took off and flew across the cow yard, made it about a third of the way across, and fell down to the ground dead. The other two sparrows looked at him and looked at each other and decided to just stay right where they were, so they did. Soaked up as much sun as they could, but eventually the sun went down even further, and it began to get really cold. And then the second sparrow couldn't stand the temptation any longer, and it took off for the barn. And it made it about 2/3 of the way across, and it fell dead. And the last sparrow sat there on that pump handle, looked at the first sparrow, looked at the second one, and decided he's just going to stay right where he was. And he did, but it got darker and it got colder, and pretty soon he just couldn't stand it any longer. Then a light went on in the barn, and that was just too big a temptation. And he took off for the barn, flew just as fast as he could, and he made it about halfway across, and he went down deader than a doornail. And the moral of the story is, never fly off the handle when you're full of poop. On its back in the middle of that cow yard, figuring he was going to die just like the other two, and a cow walked over the top of him and was straddling him and dropped a load right on him. And he laid there and plooped right on top of him, and he thought, oh no, this is the way I'm going to die. This is terrible. What a terrible way to die. But you know, that poop was kind of warm, and after a little while he started to feel a little bit warmer, and he raised his head up and he looked around him and he saw a couple of bits of food, and he grabbed those, and now he was feeling warm, and He had a little something in the stomach, and he got so happy he started to sing. And a cat was in the barn, and the cat heard him singing and figured out where he was in the cow yard and snuck down there and helped him out of the poop. Of course, I had him for dinner. The moral of the story of that one is, not everybody that craps on you is your enemy. Not everybody that helps you out is your friend. And if things are going reasonably well, don't sing about it.
Again, this is the COWCH interview with Ray Norrgard, part 2 on Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020. Tell us what the high points and low points were in your career.
You know, I answered this last time.
Did you already cover this one? All right, then we will move on to the next one. I forgot. What was your most dangerous or frightening experience?
It actually occurred on the job.
Yeah. Can't think of one? We can skip this question.
Well, I was out on Upper Rice Lake in Clearwater County during a thunderstorm with lightning. And that was kind of nerve-wracking.
What was your most humorous experience? Any particularly funny story that stands out?
Well, it might be being in a canoe with Rob Naplin on Pollywog Lake on the Chippewa National Forest, and Rob was giving me a bad time about my balance, and I was sitting in front of the canoe kind of wedged in and with equipment behind me, and Rob was running the motor, and then all of a sudden seemed like we were just drifting and we were kind of turning, and as the canoe turned, I saw that Rob was in the water backstroking for shore, and the motor was still running. And that was the first time I realized, and I'd been on the water a lot with Rob, both professionally and recreationally, and that was the first time I realized that he did not know how to swim.
That is pretty funny. What do you think are your three most significant contributions to the field?
Well, I think two of them are certainly the efforts to get dedicated funding. First, through the Reinvest in Minnesota program in 1986, and then with the Outdoor Heritage Act right at the turn of the century. Both of those efforts resulted in a tremendous increase in funding for wildlife projects.
Would you also say that those two are the things that you're most proud of?
Oh, I think so, especially RIM. I was more involved with RIM than I was with the Outdoor Heritage Fund efforts. I helped as much as I could on the Outdoor Heritage Fund, but in the efforts with the Reinvest in Minnesota program, I served as co-chair on the RIM Coalition, and I served as the recording secretary for the RIM Coalition for several years. I developed a slideshow to be used to help pass it, and a brochure, and then worked with all the different groups. There are 52 different organizations involved in the RIM Coalition, from Sierra Club Project Environment to the Deer Hunters, and Minnesota Corn Growers Association was even involved. So it was a tremendous effort across the conservation community in Minnesota.
Name 3 people you believe are the most influential in developing the field of wildlife management, and why.
Not just in Minnesota, just in general.
Could be just in Minnesota if you want to focus the question that way, or it could be 3 in general.
The first one I would name was, might surprise some, but it was the first book that I read that really got me interested in wildlife management, and that was Deward Allen, who I believe was with the University of Michigan. He wrote a book called Our Wildlife Legacy, which laid out a lot of the basic paradigms that we use today in wildlife management. I would have to say that because of the timing of when I read it, Deward Allen was actually more influential, at least in my life, than Aldo Leopold, although they were both active about the same time.
So that would be the one of them. Do you have a second and third?
Yes. I think Harvey K. Nelson was very influential. Within the Fish and Wildlife Service, he was the energy behind establishing the Northern Prairie Research Station at Jamestown, North Dakota. And Harvey was really important in terms of recognizing, number one, the importance of research, but also the importance of research that benefited field management. So he was also behind the Mid-Continent Project, which was designed to take the research findings from Northern Prairie and put them to work on the ground and evaluate them from a cost-benefit standpoint.
And number 3 would be who?
Art Hawkins. Art was a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who was among the first to do the spring waterfowl breeding counts, who always emphasized science in discussions, and who was very energetic about putting the health of wildlife populations first.
So next question. What qualities or characteristics do you think makes a good wildlife professional?
Well, I think the first thing is to be a good observer. And the second thing is to be good at data management, to be religious about recording those observations, recording changes, recording activities, and keeping a record of it so that not only can you go back to them and learn from them, but others can learn from what you did. That was probably my greatest failure as a wildlife biologist, that I didn't do a better job of that,
The observing or the data management?
the data management.
Sometimes data management gets tough. You get busy and you get the notes and you bring them back to the office, and then you need to find the time to put the notes where you can find them, where someone else can find them.
Well, and then designing the management system so you can find what you want when you want to find it.
Right.
But it's much easier now than it was before with our new electronic equipment. I mean, anybody that's got an iPhone now can take a pictorial record of a project and what it looks like. Be able to write a few notes on the photo and send it right to your computer at your office. There's almost no excuse for not keeping a good record nowadays.
Why would you recommend someone become a wildlife professional today?
I think one of those reasons is the importance of public service. I have a strong belief in the importance of public service as a career, and that doesn't, sometimes people think of it as only as working for a governmental agency, but the reality is that anyone who is involved in with an NGO or in medicine, I would say ministry, or in education is serving the public or doing volunteer work. I don't think there's anything more rewarding than public service.
What are your thoughts on the future of the profession?
Well, I'm a little concerned about, although I recognize the importance of research and the importance of statistical analysis in getting the most out of that research, I think I'm beginning to see a less reliance and almost a disdain for the observations of skilled observers. And most of the basic tenets that we hold dear now about wildlife ecology really came from skilled observers who wrote down and recorded their observations, but it was by observations. So I just think that there are times that we discount what's reported in observations when we shouldn't. There are people out there in professions that spend even more time in nature than we do. Farmers, bait trappers, fur trappers. And although they don't necessarily have to agree with their conclusions, I think we should pay attention to their observations. Some of them are very skilled observers. They have to be because their livelihoods depend on it. And I would include some hunters and anglers in that as well. There are times when we almost discount completely comments from wildlife recreationists, and I think that's foolhardy to do that.
Is there anything that you know now, after your years of experience, that you wished you knew earlier in your career, or you wished you had learned sooner?
Almost everything. I guess in terms of college courses, I wish I'd spent more time and put more emphasis on soils. They're the key to all kinds of abundance, including wildlife. Understanding how soils work and how it fits in with geology is really critical to understanding ecoregions and distribution of both plant and animal species. The other thing is somewhat related is chemistry. Having a better grasp of organic chemistry would be helpful in both soils and water management.
Are there any other thoughts you would like to share before we wrap it up?
Gosh, I really can't think of anything else now.
Okay.
Although I would say that I have, I think our audience is primarily TWS members.
Yes.
Many of whom are still students or are young professionals. That I'm very optimistic when I look at the quality of the people that are coming up through the ranks now as professionals. Well trained, enthusiastic, dedicated, and committed. And that's so it makes me very optimistic because there'll be a lot of challenges ahead. And if we look at environmental issues in general, because of the charismatic nature and the economic value of wildlife species, fish and wildlife professionals are almost always going to be on the front line of environmental issues. So you'll be playing a very important role in future years. Things aren't going to get easier, they're going to get more difficult. Although I'm somewhat optimistic that we're going to see much better leadership on international and national levels when it comes to the environment. Right now that's a little bit difficult to imagine, but I'm confident it'll come. Politics, like nature, the only constant is change. And everything's connected with everything else, so economic issues are as much a part of environmental issues as human health is.
Okay.